is a remarkable young woman. She's, you know, when I look at all of us in our aging lives, and there she is, this incredibly energetic young person who figured out that we needed to tell a story. And I think the best thing that I can say about her book, and let her speak and tell you how she came to this, was one of the quotes on the back of the book. And it said, "It's a remarkable medical story that we haven't heard before, reconstructing a polio crisis, the heroic medical efforts to keep patients alive." And I think we have all benefited in some way from, if not personally, then through family, of having an ICU and having ventilation. And here is the story of how it all began. So with a full heart, I want to introduce Dr. Hannah to everybody. So where are you, Hannah? And you have the spotlight.
Hey, well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to get to speak to this particular group. I'm excited this morning to both share with you the story in my book, but also, you know, I was very aware of the goal of this group and the advocacy work that you all do regarding polio, and to try to sort of maybe give you a few extra tools to add to your many in terms of that advocacy work. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to share that now, and I just want to double check that you can see that. Great.
Yes.
And so I've entitled my talk a little broader than just my book, Medical Advances as a Result of Polio. And I want to recognize, as Ina mentioned, you know, obviously I am a younger generation than many of you. And for me, learning about polio was not really firsthand experience. I am a physician by training. And so what was remarkable was how little I knew about polio because of my training. And sort of my journey to learning about it was that I did have exposure to a family friend by the name of Judy Monk, who was a friend of my parents and who was in a wheelchair for much of her life due to having had polio in her late teens. And this was explained to me as a child. And so I knew of the concept of polio, but not much more. I do think that for most people, certainly in the United States, the main information they have about polio comes from learning about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so, you know, because of that, it is still a little bit in people's consciousness, because that's obviously taught in school about why he was in a wheelchair, and et cetera, et cetera. And then more recently, I got further exposure to thinking about polio through reading Philip Roth's book, Nemesis, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but if not, it is fiction, but it is a fictionalized account of a polio epidemic in the 1940s. And this was important to me because it really, for me, not having lived through that era, really captured better than most that real fear of in the United States, the summers, and what that was like for children and for parents. And so really this was my sum total exposure to polio before embarking on this work and this research. And so I've come a long way in learning myself about the disease, and grateful to a lot of people for that. Now, I normally at this point in the talk go through sort of what is polio and what does it do. I'm going to skip all that. But you know, I recognize that the kind of history of the treatments for polio is not something maybe all of you have thought in depth about. So until 1928, there's no treatments for polio. And in 1928, Professor Philip Drinker comes along, and he, along with one colleague, Louis Agassiz Shaw at Boston, the School of Public Health, figures out the concept of the iron lung. And this is Philip Drinker, where he walked by a cat being having experiments done on them in this what was called a plethysmograph, a cat that was sort of sealed in, and they were interested in things like respiration of the cat, how much gas exchange there was in the skin, and also how big the breaths were that the cat was taking. And the cat had been paralyzed, and they could suck air out of that box and measure how much air went into the lungs. And in doing this, Philip Drinker walking by realized that if you just kept that plunger going in and out, you could actually make the lungs go up and down and keep that cat breathing. And he was interested in this initially due to his interest in resuscitation of people at work and things like electrocution, but it quickly realized that this was potentially useful for polio, which he'd also seen cases of walking through one of the wards at Boston Children's Hospital. And so again, I realize I'm talking to an audience well-versed in this, but just in case there's someone who hasn't thought much about this recently, the iron lung seals someone in the neck, in the casing, air gets sucked out from around the body, and this forces the chest open. and therefore forces the lungs to expand and forces air in through the mouth to fill that space. It's actually how we breathe physiologically. It's just being done by the machine rather than the muscles that in the case of polio, of course, are paralyzed. And here's actually a picture of the very first iron lung that was literally made with a vacuum motor attached to it in order to provide the suction. And you can see it's just this giant tube. This was obviously modified into what many of you may actually have experienced, which was an iron lung that looks like this. And those were also literally portholes welded on to provide access for nurses and such. They went down in Boston to the docks and bought portholes to add on when they realized they needed to provide better access for people. Now, one key piece of this was a huge lifesaver and really changed 1928, the relationship between humans and machines, this idea that humans could be supported when an organ failed briefly with a machine. However, this was very useful for kind of spinal paralysis and respiratory muscle paralysis. What it was not useful for was bulbar polio, because there you have difficulty with the swallowing, you get secretions in the back of your throat, and these just get sucked into your lungs with the iron lung. And so people would still have pneumonia and die of sort of having those secretions back there. And so still you're seeing 90% mortality for those with bulbar polio, with or without the iron lung. And that is a key piece of sort of what happened next. Now, the iron lung did become incredibly popular, particularly in the United States. And by the 1950s, early 1950s, it was in use in kind of respiratory centers. But this is a quote I have in the beginning of my book. As an intern in 1952, we admitted patients with heart attacks wherever a bed was available on the medical service, but always as far from the nurse's station as possible so that they would not be disturbed by the commotion, especially the frequent telephone ringing. It was not uncommon for me, when arriving on the medical floor at 6 a.m. to draw blood to be sent for testing, to discover that one of my heart attack patients had died quietly during the night. Older physicians accepted this as just the way it was. Now, obviously, this description is not about polio, but I think it serves the wider purpose of giving a reminder of general medical care in the early 1950s, which really was this nihilism, that there were a few things that could be done for certain types of patients, but for your average sick patient in the hospital, there really was not a lot on offer. And even for polio, as mentioned, if you had a certain type of polio, the iron lung could help. But for those with bulbar polio, it really was a lot like the heart attack patients in terms of what the care was, which was essentially leave you in a corner room, make you comfortable, and not much else to be done. So, all right, just having a little trouble advancing. What happened there? There we go. So that's the state of things in the early 1950s. And I learned about sort of the next major leap reading this book about 20 years ago called The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine by James Le Fanu. I was a medical student at the time doing a degree in public health or in epidemiology. And in this book, it catalogs in the 20th century, each chapter, an important episode in advancing medicine. So you've got Banting and Best with insulin, you've got Alexander Fleming and penicillin. And then I came across this one chapter about a polio epidemic in 1952 in Copenhagen. And as far as I could tell since then, this remained, up until very recently, the only information about this epidemic written for the general public. And it's an extraordinary story, and I'm about to share that story with you if you haven't encountered it. And I felt it needed to be told because it was really highlights the importance of polio in the rise of much of modern medicine. So the story takes place at the Blydam Hospital, which was in Copenhagen. It no longer exists, but it was the infectious disease hospital for the city, and in fact for the surrounding area as well, and really much of Denmark. And they were experts in the care of polio patients, mostly because the head of the hospital was this man, Henry Kai Alexander Larsen, who had been head of the hospital for many years. They'd never had a major epidemic. They'd had sort of a spike in 1944 during the war, but he'd seen over the years a lot of polio, but they'd never had a kind of crisis with polio until 1952. And in Copenhagen in July, August 1952, they started to see this in terms of the cases occurring. Greater than 50 cases a day, 10 to 12 per day with respiratory failure. And most importantly, the majority of these patients had symptoms of bulbar polio. Now you'll note that this begins in kind of mid to late July and is increasing, and you haven't even hit September. My book is entitled The Autumn Ghost, because in the United States and Canada and in sort of lower latitudes, you would get this spike in the summertime, the summer plague, and then it would dissipate in September, October. Nobody quite understands why with slightly colder climate and higher latitude, but in the Scandinavian countries, this peak was shifted, and it was usually in September, October, even into November. So they knew at the start of this epidemic, as they were seeing this exponential increase in cases, that they were not even near their peak because they didn't expect a peak until September, October. So they were in big trouble. Now, I got to travel to Copenhagen researching this, and in the city archives there, they have remarkable archival material about this epidemic. All of the kind of records of the hospital are kept there. And I was welcomed there by this little owl at the archive. And one of the things I found there was this big black book. And this book contained every death in the hospital recorded in the year of 1952. And as I flip through the pages in sort of May, June, you get things like tetanus, diphtheria, and then July, and you start to see these polio cases. And then by mid to late August, it's just polio, 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 every one of these cases. And so by the middle to late of August 1952, 27 of 31 patients who've had bulbar polio have died. It's an 87% mortality. And this is really, that's the 90% mortality I described. Now, importantly, they had one iron lung in the hospital and 6 cuirass respirators, the ones that sort of strap over the chest. They recognized that more iron lungs were probably not the answer because they were seeing so much bulbar polio, and they knew in terms of their experience with putting these patients in the iron lung that it was not successful. So although they didn't have access to sort of the standard treatment, they recognized that that was not going to be the solution, and they didn't have a solution. They didn't know what to do, and they were very worried about what was going to happen in the fall. Now, you can sort of see here written, each doctor signed their name when they put in these deaths. One of them that's on here twice is the name of Dr. Mogens Bjornbo. Apologies to any Danish speakers on this call. Very much the American pronunciation of his name. He was a junior doctor. He was quite young, but had seen a fair amount and was very much trusted by Lassen, who was the head of the hospital. And he started badgering Lassen to invite in to talk to them an anesthesiologist by the name of Bjorn Ibsen. Now, Lassen resisted, but the real question is, why did Bjornbo know about this man, and why did he think he could help? Well, back in December 1949, Mogens Bjornbo had been on a ship, the MS Jutlandia, and this is actually the ship's manifest, which I found online, from that sailing. And here he is sailing from New York back to Copenhagen, having visited the United States. And on the ship was Bjorn Ibsen's wife, Doris Ibsen, with her 2 children. And they met. And Doris Ibsen told Mogens Bjornbo about her husband, and it stuck. This information about this man who was training in the United States, and Mogens Bjornbo ran into him years later. Now, who was Bjorn Ibsen? He originally started training as a surgeon, and then he got interested in anesthesia, and he wanted to become an anesthesiologist. But in Denmark, in the late 1940s, there was no such thing as an anesthesiologist. They literally did not exist. And so you would have a nurse or a medical student or even the surgeon's secretary giving anesthesia at times in the 1930s and 40s. So he recognized there was this need. He wanted to become an expert, and he was told there's no anesthesia in Denmark. So if you want to learn anesthesia, you need to go west. So he went to Mass General Hospital in 1949 to study under Henry Beecher, who was the head of anesthesia there at the time. And in the United States, it was a little more developed. They had some anesthesia programs. And so he learns anesthesia, but this is just after the war. And he's dazzled by the United States and sort of the plethora of stuff, but also he's dazzled by the American medical system and what he felt was a different culture that was a lot less hierarchical and sort of stuck in the mud than the Danish culture that he was used to. And these are his descriptions of his views on working there. He said, at conferences, the young American doctors expressed themselves freely and without inhibitions. I began to understand here that I was among doctors who thought differently and along other lines than those I was familiar with. And crucially, he noted that he initially thought there were a lot more complications from anesthesia than he'd seen back in Denmark. But then he realized that no, it was actually just that they talked about the complications they'd had. They actually discussed them because they felt they could maybe make things better by understanding what had happened, as opposed to the nihilism that he viewed in Denmark, which was that, oh, complications happen and that's just the way it is, and move on and forget about it. And, you know, someone died and that's what happens. So this was a real sort of culture shift for him. And he takes this back to Denmark with him and becomes a kind of itinerant anesthesiologist. And Mogens Bjornboe remembers his name 2.5 years later when he's dealing with a tetanus patient who he's trying, a baby who he's trying to keep alive. And he calls on Ibsen. The baby dies, but they've worked together for about 4 or 5 days. And this is in June 1952. And Bjornboe's really impressed by him and starts badgering Lassen, saying, I think he can help us. Lassen initially resists because he doesn't know who this guy is. He's very junior. And he then finally relents on August 25th, 1952. And Ibsen gets called to a meeting in Lassen's office. 20 people piled in the room, all desperate for something to do to help their patients. Apparently, they were quite depressed because they'd been dealing with so many deaths. And Ibsen walks in and Lassen says to him, what do you know about taking care of polio patients? Ibsen's response is essentially absolutely nothing. Now, this is where I think Lassen deserves a lot of credit, because despite the hierarchy of Danish medicine, despite being a distinguished professor of infectious diseases, rather than kicking Ibsen out, he says, I'm going to take you on a tour of the hospital and show you what these patients look like. So they take a tour, and Ibsen notices something in the patients he's seeing. They have, the ones who are close to death have high blood pressure, fast heart rate, twitching, confusion, and clammy skin. And Lassen explains to him, he says, this is end-stage polio. This is what it looks like. The virus has infiltrated the brain. It's overwhelmed the brain. It's overwhelmed the kidneys. The body's shutting down. There's nothing more to be done for these patients. This is polio. Ibsen, not indoctrinated with the kind of received wisdom about polio, looks at these same patients and says, actually, I think this is carbon dioxide retention, that these symptoms we're seeing are due to that. Now, again, I realize I'm talking with a kind of highly educated audience here in terms of thinking about this stuff, but just in case you haven't thought about it in a while, oxygen gets taken in through the lungs, brought to by red blood cells to the organs where it's used, and the sort of exhaust from that is carbon dioxide that is transported back by the blood cells into the lungs, where with each exhalation breath, you exhale the carbon dioxide. So he looked at these patients and he said, they're not breathing well enough, and the carbon dioxide is building up in their body. They're not exhaling it. And the reason he was able to say this and know that these were the symptoms that go with carbon dioxide retention was that he was the right man in the world to know about this. He'd been playing around with this device in the operating room called the Brinkmann Carbovisor. I always think it looks like something out of Willy Wonka. This machine measured end-tidal carbon dioxide, how much carbon dioxide you breathe out with each breath. And in the operating room, he'd been taking patients and hand ventilating them and watching what happened if he breathed very fast for them. The carbon dioxide levels dropped because they breathed it all out. And then what happened when he stopped breathing for them? And the carbon dioxide levels in the body would go up, and they would have the exact same symptoms as these polio patients when he was sitting there observing them. He'd even published a paper on this topic that same year. So they happened to have hit the one man in the world who was a true expert in carbon dioxide retention. So what did Ibsen propose? He said, we need to do tracheostomies on these patients. And Lassen said, actually, we've tried that to kind of protect the airway and keep those secretions from getting into the lungs. It doesn't do much. And Ibsen said to him, no, because you also need to give them positive pressure ventilation. You need to actually blow air into the lungs, let them exhale it, get all that carbon dioxide out. Now, this was radical. It had not been used outside the operating room. However, Ibsen, in another sort of stroke of incredible coincidence, knew that it had been used outside the operating room because he'd stumbled across a paper in a very obscure journal that existed for about 5 years called the Annals of Western Medicine and Surgery. LA had seen a major epidemic in 1949 of polio. It's possible some of you were in it. Selma Kelmes, who is an anesthesiologist, was actually treated during that epidemic in 1949. I got to speak with her. And during that epidemic, they were seeing 90% mortality from bulbar polio. The difference was they had a lot of iron lungs. They still were seeing 90% mortality. And Albert Bauer and V. Ray Bennett, the two primary authors on this paper, came up with something to solve that problem. What they did was they added a tracheostomy and a positive pressure attachment to the iron lung. So they were sucking the lungs open with the negative pressure ventilation. At the same time, they were pushing air into the lungs with the positive pressure ventilation. So this protected the airway and allowed for a good ventilation at the same time. And they reported in this paper that they decreased the mortality from 90% to 20%. Pretty remarkable and kind of lost, except for the fact that Ibsen had come across this paper and crucially recognized something really important, which was that you didn't need the iron lung at all. You just needed the positive pressure ventilation. And he knew this from the operating room, where when he put someone to sleep and paralyzed them with curare, he ventilated them, using positive pressure ventilation, and he felt you could do this long term. So he proposed using a much simpler system than this complicated one that was used in LA called the Waters to and fro circuit. And just to take you through it, it's got an oxygen tank attached to a humidifier and tubing that led to basically the cuffed tracheostomy in someone. And then there was a rubber bag on the end to push the air in by hand. And the soda line was to scavenge the exhaled exhaled carbon dioxide so that you didn't rebreathe the carbon dioxide. Very simple system. Lassen says, I'm going to allow you to try this on one patient. He's not totally convinced, but he's got nothing else to try. And so on August 26th, a little girl by the name of Vivi Ebert gets admitted to the hospital in Copenhagen. She's about 9 in this picture. She was actually 12 when she was admitted to the hospital. This is the house in Copenhagen she lived in. She lived with her mother on one floor and her grandparents were on the other. She actually lived on the second floor, which for those of you who have dealt with the aftermath of polio will know that that became a problem for her later in life. But she's admitted to the hospital and she has classic symptoms of bulbar polio. And they know 90% mortality for someone like her. Essentially, she's going to die. The next morning on August 27th, Lassen rounds on her and points to her and says, okay, she's the one, you can try it on her. Basically, there's nothing to lose. They know they're going to lose her. And so Ibsen gets called in, they call in an ENT surgeon, everybody piles in to watch. And then Ibsen makes a small mistake. He's worried she's so close to death that if he puts her to sleep with anesthetic, that he might kill her. She might have a cardiac arrest. And so he asked the ENT surgeon to do the tracheostomy under local anesthetic, which he does. However, there's more bleeding because it's a little bit harder. And so Ibsen takes over her care and she's now near death because she's not been breathing well. And she's also gone into bronchospasm because of the irritation from the blood in her lungs. And we have Ibsen's minute-by-minute record of that time. And he writes, now in a situation where we cannot perform ventilation because of her spasms and agitation. At this point, apparently, everybody literally left for lunch. Not because they were callous, but because they didn't want to see her die. They were worried that this was the end. Lassen says to Ibsen, if when I come back from lunch, she's still struggling like this, you need to stop. So Ibsen takes a risk. He realizes he's got to break that spasm. And so the only way to do that is to relax her muscles and put her completely to sleep. And he administers pentothal 100 milligrams, risking that this is going to cause her to drop her blood pressure and go into cardiac arrest. And he gets lucky and he stabilizes her. And within 15 minutes, he writes, the patient is immediately warm and dry as he's sitting there hand ventilating her. Everybody comes back from lunch and it is truly like a miracle has occurred because they know the natural course of this disease better than anyone. And Lassen recognizes a good thing when he sees it. And he says, right, we need to do this to everybody who's coming in with respiratory failure. This is what we would call an N of 1 experiment, right? Tried on one person, not what we advocate now, but they didn't have anything else to go with. And so they went with this. Only one problem, as you've probably recognized, there's no ventilators at this point in history. There are a few that exist in operating rooms in a few scattered places in the US and Sweden, none in Denmark. So famously, they turned to the medical students of Copenhagen to come to the hospital and sit at the bedside of all of these patients after they'd done a tracheostomy on them and hand ventilate them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months. And that is exactly what they did. Up to 70 patients at one point were hand ventilated like this. They had massive amounts of equipment, massive numbers of nurses had to be increased, massive numbers of students. In total, about 1,200 medical and dental students participated in this to keep people alive. Of course, you know better than me, if you have polio, you're not asleep. And so the students and the patients got to know each other quite well. Many of them became friends. There was a lot of entertaining of the patients, as you can see here, and also a lot of sort of almost invention of how to communicate with patients, because many of them, of course, had full paralysis of their bodies. And so they did get creative with eye blinking, with, kind of pens and mouths to point at things. All of the kind of early stuff for ways to communicate with people were used in this hospital. I got to meet one of the medical students. She was 90 years old, Anne Holton Jensen. She actually became an anesthesiologist because of her experience doing this. She did die last year, but this was an incredibly formative experience for her as a medical student. We do have film from the epidemic, and just to show you what it looked like, a lot of hand cramping described, as you can imagine, seeing them sit here. They got a 10-minute break every hour for a cigarette and to stretch their legs, but it was incredibly stressful work. These were students, many of them who had never been near a patient before in their lives, and suddenly they were handed this job that really, if anything went wrong, and it did and could, the patient's life was at stake. But really remarkable. They stepped up, were incredibly successful at this. Very quickly, within months, they realized they needed machines to take over, and they created what they literally called mechanical students at first. You get this explosion in the development of mechanical ventilators that comes from this epidemic and the realization that this is a safe and effective way to take care of people. And of course, nurses loved it because, unlike the iron lung, they could access patients' bodies and provide good nursing care in a way that was much harder with the iron lung. Now, another key piece that came out of this epidemic is something maybe a little more obscure, but in the medical world, incredibly important. There was one measurement in the blood that they'd been able to make at the Blydam Hospital, and it was what was called total bicarbonate. It was, in fact, a measure of bicarbonate, which is a buffer in the blood, and carbon dioxide, which we know is building up in these patients. And carbon dioxide is an acid. And so if you measure the pH of the blood, Ibsen recognized it would be like lemon juice. It would be a very low pH, really acidic. They said, no, we've measured the bicarbonate in the blood and it's very high. They didn't understand that carbon dioxide was a component of this. And they said, well, we've never measured it, but we think the pH would be very alkalotic. Now, this was Paul Astrup. He was the head of the laboratory at the Blydam Hospital. And he later said it was like a light bulb went off, that Ibsen said, this is what's going on. He said, oh my God, we need to test this. He did not have a pH monitor. He did not have a way to check the pH of the blood. Basically, nobody did. But he knew somebody who did down the road, which was Radiometer AS, a company that had been contracted by Carlsberg Brewery to measure the pH of the blood of beer, measure the pH of beer, not of blood, but that the machine could be borrowed and actually used to measure the pH of blood. And when he did, sure enough, Ibsen was correct. The pH was very low because the carbon dioxide in the bloodstream was very high. He recognized the importance of this, that if you're going to kind of be assessing how well someone's breathing, that this was a key way of measuring that. What was the pH of the blood? Was it high or low or just right? And so he creates a system to do this quickly and efficiently at the bedside. And he wrote, by January 1st, 1953, we had done 705 determinations of pH. This was a whole revolution in the way we could see into people's bodies and care for people who were having difficulty with breathing. And this is something we use at the bedside every day in ICUs worldwide. This is from the web. You can actually pull one off for $16,000. A blood gas analyzer can be yours. For many years, they were actually called astrips rather than blood gases because of his involvement. Now, the epidemic peaked in October and November. They went from 87% mortality for those who had respiratory failure to about 36 midway through and down to 11% by the end. Extraordinary numbers in terms of effectiveness of this treatment for people with respiratory failure. And Lassen lost no time in sharing this. And he did not do it in an obscure journal. He published in The Lancet. You will note, for those of you who are in academic medicine, this is meaningful. There is one name on this paper. It is HCA Lassen. He was not inclined to give credit for what had happened to anyone else. And this became a major battle between him and Ibsen later in life. Interesting, Bjorn, who was actually the one who brought them together and recognized Ibsen had something to offer, didn't seem to be involved in this fight over who should get credit. And I want to sort of acknowledge that he deserves a lot of credit. But importantly, Lassen got this out there. Now, what about Ibsen? He went to the municipal hospital, the local community hospital, the next year, and he had a vision. He wanted to take everything he'd learned, and here in these windows, he creates what we consider the first modern intensive care unit in the world. Now, why do I say that? Because he took everything he'd learned and read here from the epidemic taking care of polio patients. He had a dedicated area for them, 24/7 staffing, blood gas analysis, mechanical ventilation, and specialized nursing. Then from the operating room and his experience with anesthesia, he had other organ support and resuscitation skills. And he also imported the idea of that frequent vitals and monitoring you get in modern ICUs. And then this last piece is his vision. He recognized that this way of treating polio patients who had bulbar polio could be applied to a range of patients, that anyone who had respiratory failure, essentially from any cause, might benefit from this type of support. And so he opens it up not just to polio patients, not just to surgical patients, but to all patients. This catches on slowly. 1958 in North America, Peter Saffer in Baltimore, Max Harry-Weil in Los Angeles, and Barry Fairley in Toronto all found sort of first ICUs of North America. And Peter Saffer actually writes in his memoir, he literally says, we knew what they had done in Copenhagen. And that was really essential for them creating these units to care for this wide range of patients. This then is a direct line to what we consider modern intensive care units. And this is, although it looks like, lots of gadgets and gizmos, the reality is the fundamentals of the care being provided in modern ICUs is exactly the same as that care that Ibsen was providing in that first ICU. And here's me during COVID-19. I do work in the intensive care unit, and I was very, very aware of the fact that the fundamentals of the care I was providing to every COVID patient and every other patient in the ICU was support with mechanical ventilation, plus minus sedation and paralysis, and just those, and good nursing care. And that was really what got people through and was really important in my mind for people to understand that this all stemmed from polio, this all stemmed from this one revolution. So what did we learn from polio? Well, from this one single epidemic, we get ventilators, blood gases, respiratory physiology, and a whole new interest and recognition that they didn't actually know very much about respiratory physiology, and modern intensive care units. However, I want to take the last little bit to talk about a few other things, because a lot more also came from polio that I do touch on in the book, but not in great detail. Rehabilitation medicine, disability rights, vaccine, of course, and then the long-term sequelae of viruses. Now, I think it's important to recognize that so much of modern rehabilitation medicine comes from what is learned taking care of polio patients. And I want to point to Warm Springs. Some of you may even have been there for your own. It's one of the places on my bucket list to go visit. But of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt found Warm Springs as a place for those who have had polio to come receive comprehensive rehabilitation. And he recognized you needed orthopedic surgeons and massage therapists and physical therapists, and that it wasn't just the domain of one individual. And this gets propagated, and people in Denmark and other places look to Warm Springs as the model for how to provide good rehabilitation medicine. Now, of course, you also have world wars and other reasons that people are developing supportive rehabilitation care that's not just about polio, but I think it's important to recognize what a big part polio played in helping people to regain function as much as possible. Of course, this idea of changing from bed rest as the way to deal with sort of severe illness, and particularly muscular illness and mobilization, really comes from Sister Kenny, who I think some of you have met, and the kind of hot packs and the stretching and physical therapy that she advocated. And it did take some time for this to, kind of get into common, there was a lot of pushback. It took a while for this to get in common practice, but again, is the fundamentals that we don't have people just languishing in bed in the ICU. We actually have physical therapists who work in the intensive care unit now, who even when people are still on ventilators and quite sick, will get them up, moving around as much as possible. And this is a direct result, in my mind, of her advocacy and the work for polio patients. We have some incredible footage from the tail end of the epidemic. This actually says Blijdam's Hospitalet. This is the Blijdam Hospital, and kind of incredible color footage. I use this to try to motivate people who work in intensive care to say, look what they could do within the first 6 months to a year of having people on ventilators. They were able to get them outside into the sunshine. One thing that we don't do is this anymore, which is give people cigarettes while they're actually on ventilators. But I think that it is important to recognize that here, their ability to recognize that just because these people needed respiratory support did not mean that they should be stuck languishing in hospital beds, and to also gives you a little bit of a sense of what the early ventilators looked like, and that that kind of getting people up and out of hospital settings was important. Here's this little boy, and you can see he actually does have a tracheostomy there, a silver metal tracheostomy, and obviously his arms have been affected, and with a fair amount of paralysis there. Some of the individuals in the epidemic who ultimately styled themselves the Respinauts, and were unable to be weaned from ventilators. One of them was Vivi Ebert, that first patient. She was able, though, however, to live a full life. She left the hospital once in Copenhagen. They built a purpose-built apartment complex where they could provide appropriate 24-hour ventilatory care for her. So she was able to leave. She couldn't go back home, obviously, for multiple reasons. One of them being that issue that she lived on the second floor with her mother, the other that she needed the support from the ventilator. Another woman who was also remained ventilator dependent was Rosa Abramson, and she became a poet. She had use of one full hand and a few fingers on the other, had a special built typewriter, and I do have a little bit of her poetry translated in my book, but for copyright reasons, I couldn't do more. But it's absolutely beautiful poetry, some of it heartbreaking, but she really kind of shared her experience of being, in the hospital for many years and dealing with polio in beautiful poetry. This is the map from the 1952 epidemic. Each dot here is one of these pins, which was one of the polio cases. I was privileged to meet some of these pins, who are, of course, people. These are many of the people who are profiled in my book along the way. I kind of weave their stories in. And I was very grateful to all of them and the many others who spoke to me, explained to me their experiences. And I want to mention that every single one of these individuals has been dealing with post-polio syndrome. And for me, this was new. I'd come across the term taking care of 1 or 2 patients in the ICU, but I did not know really what post-polio syndrome was. And so I think that gives you a sense of how much education is needed, that here I was as someone who is an intensive care doctor interested in this topic, and I knew nothing when I started about what this experience was like. There is a review article, but is now quite old, almost 25 years old, about post-polio syndrome that was in JAMA. I think awareness is increasing a little bit. It's something that I talk about a lot when I give this talk to medical audiences, and I spend more time on it and sort of the background of post-polio syndrome and all of that, because there is a huge need to educate medical people about this. And I have to say, it has made me pause and wonder, when we've struggled to wean someone from a ventilator, for instance, unexpectedly, whether or not this might be someone now in retrospect who might have had post-polio syndrome, maybe a mild case that then obviously sort of got worse as they were dealing with a critical illness. And I keep scrolling back in my head, wondering how often that's happened. I think it's very hard to know, but it has changed my thinking about sort of the difficulty of weaning patients and what we might do to sort of get better history on individuals. And then finally, I think this is something that polio's legacy in terms of post-polio syndrome is important for everybody thinking about the future. Obviously, post-polio syndrome is not the only long-term consequence of a virus. There are others. Probably the best and easiest to explain is herpes zoster, that chickenpox. You get chickenpox as a child, and it can reactivate as shingles. And so that's a simple reactivation. It's easy for people to understand. Then you also have things like Epstein-Barr virus and this relationship that is now clear with multiple sclerosis. And to me, this brings up a very scary question about COVID-19. And I think it's important to recognize what the descriptions of long COVID to me is like, more like the long-term paralysis that people have after polio. It's the immediate consequences after the acute illness. What I wonder about is whether there could be a post-COVID syndrome 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, which is closer to what is dealt with in terms of post-polio syndrome, this kind of much later effects. And we don't know, but I think it's important for us to be thinking along those lines and to learn from post-polio syndrome everything we can to understand how and why these things happen later in life. If you ever need advertisement for vaccination, this is it. This is from the vaccine from polio. Those are cases in blue and the sort of precipitous drop after the introduction in 1955. It's really remarkable. Want to put out there, though, some numbers. These are very much back of the envelope. This is literally pulled from the internet, but worldwide, since 1988, 1.5 million lives saved by the polio vaccine, 18 million able to walk who wouldn't otherwise. Incredible numbers, incredibly important. However, I want to give you some other numbers. Just in the US alone, since 1988, my back of the envelope calculation, 15 million lives saved by mechanical ventilation. So to help you to recognize that it's not just the vaccine that has saved lives in terms of the impact of polio, but in mechanical ventilation and intensive care as well, which is why I think it's really important to celebrate what Bjorn Ibsen and others contributed. And it is actually this year, the 70th anniversary of that first ICU that he created in 1953. So I'm going to stop there. Obviously a plug for my book. It is written for the general public, very much for people who are in medicine, who've had polio, but also people who are coming at it with absolutely no knowledge of any of that, to enjoy the story, appreciate what people have been through. And I hope that it will help people to remember what it was like before the vaccine in terms of the stories I tell of the individuals who experienced polio, and that might help all of you in your advocacy work to help remind people as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and left a little bit of time for questions. Thank you so much for.
Bravo, bravo. Hannah, thank you. Every time I listen to you, I am better for it. So really, thank you so much for giving us the time today. Are there any questions? I don't know who else is on the list. John Nanny, are you still with us? And are there any questions?
I am, but John McFarland will be doing the Q&A because I have to run.
Okay, I'll miss you. Where's McFarland and where are the questions, please, if there are any?
Believe it or not, there aren't, because it was so wonderfully done. But there is one comment There is
Yeah.
one comment which I'm not sure whether Hannah actually realizes. You mention in your book some of the people like Lies, Kai, and Carl Hager, who you unfortunately didn't meet. Carl Hager was the head of Polio Denmark, PTU as was. Carl Hager was saved by this as he was a patient in 1952 in the hospital. Carl Hager was the lead author and the one who drove through the United Nations Charter on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So that hospital actually enhanced the lives of every disabled person around the world.
Yeah, no, that's a remarkable direct line. You're right, which I need to add, I think, to make it clearer that you know, as I said, I touch on that issue of disability rights. It's obviously not the focus of my book, but it was, you know, kind of this eye-opener for me to realize how much advocacy came from polio survivors and how important that was for the disability movement in many countries and worldwide, to your point.
Lawrence Lund, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, if someone today has high blood pressure,
I think
Will you mute? Careful, Florence, keep muting. Be careful.
I think I can see the question in the chat. I think that raised blood pressure today can result from a buildup of carbon dioxide.
right?
Yeah, so I think acutely, so if somebody in a very quick time has a rise in carbon dioxide and presents with a sudden high blood pressure, absolutely, that, you know, if people haven't realized that it is a buildup of carbon dioxide, that can be the cause. For people where the carbon dioxide has built up slowly, the body does equilibrate in a way. And so, for instance, we know this from COPD patients, that they tend to live with a higher carbon dioxide level. Their ability to exhale is not great. And you can see it in a lot of the measurements in the blood gas. And so for those people, when it's that gradual increase and you're sort of just at a new set point in terms of living with a slightly higher carbon dioxide, that probably does not impact directly the blood pressure in the same way. But in the acute period, if it happens quickly, 100% something to be considered. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Florence. Anything else on there today, John?
I can't see any.
I see some raised hands. Diane Wall, is that?
Janie? Oh, there's Diane, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
if we come across a doctor or a medical staff person that is not aware of post-polio, what's the one book or the one article or name that we can give them? You know, it has to be short because they're very important.
Yeah. I would suggest, even though it's maybe a little out of date, I mean, the concepts are not changed since about 2000. Doctors will trust JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's an article rather than a book. I think a book will overwhelm most doctors and they'll just tune out. They'll see it as authoritative, and it will allow them also just to recognize that this is something that is well recognized because there is a review article about it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I'm happy to send I can send a copy on to Ina or someone else and have it circulated if that's helpful. So, you know, as I said, there may be some nuances that the thinking has changed a little bit since then, but I think that's your best way of getting their attention to say, this is a real thing. This is what basically you should know to understand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll make sure that everybody gets that who's on the mailing list.
George in Scotland, is your turn.
George in Scotland.
Hi, Hannah. I really enjoyed the book and thoroughly enjoyed your talk. It sort of brought it really to life. However, this is maybe the $64,000 question. How do we get training on polio and PPS back into the curriculum for doctors training?
Yeah, you know, the depressed, nihilistic version of would be we have a bad polio outbreak, right? Which unfortunately tends to be the way these things work. Certainly the amount of interest in my book did spike when there was that one case in New York, for better or worse. So, not what I would hope for. I think, I do think that there is the potential almost to harness the COVID stuff to the benefit of polio survivors. And I think people who suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome are sort of facing the same thing, right? For different reasons, they've been struggling to get people to notice and care about and think about their disease. And so I do think that there is a benefit to it, although I made the distinction between long COVID and PPS, be saying they're actually not really equivalent. In terms of some of the symptomatology, they are, right? In terms of the fatigue and some of the autonomic dysfunction and things like that. So I think that may be the best way to kind of almost get it bundled in with, these are the types of diseases that all face these challenges, and that we can talk about all of them and learn about all of them. Now, that may or may not do a disservice to post-polio syndrome, because of course it is a separate entity with a separate history to it and such. But I'll be honest, they don't teach intensive care in medical school. I get residents, trainees who have come out of medical school who have never set foot in an ICU, because the fact that it sort of has its foundations in the 1950s and many places didn't get ICUs till the 70s and 80s, the medical school curriculum hasn't even caught up to that, to say this is important because so many people out there in the course of their lifetime will be in an intensive care unit. You need to know what happens in an intensive care unit. Even if you don't know how to work a ventilator, you need to understand what someone's been through. So that, I think it kind of unfortunately goes along with the fact that the medical school curriculums really are so slow to shift. It's like, turning a ship. So I don't think I have a great answer for you there, but just some musings more than anything else.
That was good.
Thank you.
That was good. Anything else anybody has to say?
So there was a
I'm
question
wondering-
about higher blood pressure and polio patients, typical among polio patients, whether, that for people who maybe have slightly increased carbon dioxide at baseline, or maybe some autonomic dysfunction. I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a great question. And it certainly would fit that with autonomic dysfunction, with the difficulty sort of regulating blood pressure. However, I just want to put out there, a lot of people have high blood pressure, right? Totally unrelated. It's a very, very, very common problem. And so more likely than not, even for people with post-polio syndrome, if you're dealing with high blood pressure, it may just be unrelated and part of growing older, that your vessels stiffen up.
I also think that a lot of us hold our breath while we're walking a little bit. And then we have to catch up with breathing because we're so tense about walking. Am I right, Diane? Yeah, I think that happens too.
Ina,
Yeah.
Janie in South Africa is asking, have you, Hannah, delivered this talk to Rotary International as the whole organization, as opposed to just clubs? And then I think, Ina, after that, we ought to ask the current chair of Polio Denmark to make a comment. That's Gwaeli Nielsen, who's on screen at the moment.
Oh, excellent.
Hannah, if you could ask.
So, yes, just to answer the question, I have only spoken to a local Rotary club,
Okay.
and not to the international. I would, of course, absolutely love to assist in any way I can with, advocacy for eradication.
Okay, we'll work on that. We'll work on that, and maybe get you invited to Singapore for the next big meeting. What do you think?
Sounds great.
Don't you need a companion to go with you? Okay.
Look forward to
All
my
right.
post link.
So,
Gwaeli, would you like to make a comment?
About what, John? I didn't get it.
Well, would you? All this work was done in Denmark.
yeah.
Denmark led the way in actually forming this treatment, and PTU became Polio Denmark, and it is still working to actually help polio survivors. Denmark was the world leader.
Yes, and I was rather proud to listen to Hannah about it. I didn't know all that because I haven't been with the Polio Denmark for so many years again. But I think they do a very, very fine job. And I'm actually very proud of the organization. I'm not the president, I'm a vice president. So
Okay,
I'm very grateful to Polio
Okay.
Denmark. They provided me a lot of assistance in the research for this book. And so I was very appreciative of their efforts to assist.
so
Yeah.
Hannah, does anything that you find lead you to think about the next thing you want to research and discover?
So, well, there's all kinds of things. So in my everyday research, I do, medical research around intensive care and a little bit around anesthesia. And I am interested in doing a bit of a sort of summary of the more recent research that's out there on post-polio syndrome, recognizing that you have this review paper in 2000. There's a little bit in the anesthesia literature about the issues around giving anesthesia, not a lot. And I would like to take some time this next year to work on that, to try to provide some better summary and guidance for people, because I get asked that question a lot.
Great. Yeah.
And then in terms of books, I remain interested in sort of moments in medical history that are important, that kind of have been overlooked. And so I'm doing a little bit of research on tuberculosis as an area where I think there's also sort of stories to be told about important advances that were made in care, and is a disease that is much more still prevalent in the world today. So those are the two pieces I'm working on at the moment.
Got it. Alex, did you want to say something, or did you just throw your hands up in joy?
There was a question about.
My connection froze.
Oh, okay. Yes, Hannah?
Oh, I saw a question in the chat about specific information about anesthesia. What do you tell doctors pre-surgery? I think the best thing I can say from what I've seen of the literature is, to really impress upon them that you have post-polio syndrome, and that there is a lot of information to suggest that with the weakness that may not be apparent before you get anesthesia, that there's just a sensitivity to anesthesia, and to really to minimize anesthesia. You don't want to be telling doctors, don't give me anesthesia, because that really kind of binds their hands, unable to provide you the care. But to really, there's a lot of diseases where we try to minimize everything we give, and we're very kind of conscious of that. And so I think that's really the main message, and the need for post-operative monitoring for a longer period, because of the longer time that it can take someone to recover. So if you can get those messages across, that's the best possible thing, just to keep you safe, right? Because that's what it's about, is being safe with the anesthetic, even if it means being there a little bit longer.
Part of the advocacy that we need to teach ourselves and others is there are many times we go in for a surgical procedure that has nothing to do with any corrective surgery, and we never tell the doctor, by the way, I had polio, because it doesn't seem visible at times.
Right. And I think more than that, you need to not just say I had polio, because people think of it as something you had.
Oh, right.
And it's gone, right? Or it's resolved.
Right.
I think the really important piece is to say I had polio and I now have.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And we hand out, we try to have that anesthesia card available.
Right. I was gonna say, it's an obvious thing to you that if you had polio, this is something to worry about, but
not to them, right?
To most doctors that you talk to, unless you spell it out for them.
Right. And that's part of the advocacy we need to learn for ourselves.
Yeah.
Anything else here, everybody? I know you're all taking it all in, aren't you?
Janie's just made a comment to say that TB is a major health issue in South Africa. And that,
in many parts of the world. It's really scary.
It's increasing everywhere.
Yeah.
And that there's been comment made in the Irish press that the habits of some sportsmen do not help things when they're just going around, running around the field, and then they cough and spit.
Yes.
And that is how it was spread before.
Right.
Yeah.
No spitting campaigns, yeah.
Yeah.
Just to make you sad, and Ina, and that you're lumbered with me. The hand ventilation is what actually saved me.
Really? Well, whoever did it, I'm eternally grateful.
Yeah, right.
Right, Dick, you too. Anybody else, or else we can say goodbye to Hannah and thank her for this extraordinary day that we all will think about all day long, I'm sure.
Thank you. It is such an honor to get to speak to this group. So
Yeah.
much of the work you're doing. So thank you.
Our pleasure.
To help spread the word.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll get back to you and make sure that you get the kind of acclaim and book sales that you need. All right, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Is
Thanks,
everybody
Anna.
ready to go on with their 90-degree day somewhere?
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Thank you, Sunil. It was a really great topic today. Thank you for coming on.